Good morning, genealogy friends. Happy almost last day of the year. I'm not teaching tomorrow or Friday. I'm not teaching again until next Monday. So this is my last Facebook Live of 2020. And I was going to do a year-end wrap up and talk about everything that happened with the business in 2020, or maybe do something like, the top 5 things I learned, and then I decided that was just not that interesting for a Facebook Live. I'm probably going to send an email out to my email friends later with that kind of thing. Instead, I thought we would talk a little bit about DNA tests, because DNA tests are a really popular thing for people to get over the holidays, between the sales and the fact that people gift DNA tests. And that means that a lot of you are going to be spitting into tubes pretty soon, or you're going to be getting back DNA test results from people who you bought tests for. And there are going to be some questions. So I thought that we would talk about DNA this morning. Hello, everybody. Let me flip this around. Hello. DNA is I feel sometimes like we make DNA, as family historians, that we make DNA a little more complicated than it needs to be. But DNA is tricky because it's science. Either you're comfortable with DNA or you're not. DNA testing companies, the results can look a little bit different between companies. So you can be really comfortable with one kind of testing and not know anything about another. And I think that there's a lot of mythology around DNA tests, as far as, I took a DNA test and it turned out that my father wasn't who I thought he was, or my sister and I aren't related, or this cousin, we must not be related. Something bad must have happened in our family tree, something scandalous, because my cousin and I aren't related at the same rate that we're supposed to be. And I think sometimes that's valid, and that's why that comes up, because we hear the stories of people who take DNA tests and then find out, oh, surprise, there's something that nobody mentioned to you about your history. But a lot of the times, DNA can just cause misunderstandings because people don't understand what they're looking at. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about why, when you're looking at your DNA tests, are things uneven. Again, I was going to do a primer, just do, DNA basics, but I feel like one of the biggest questions that comes up first is, why do my sister and I both took a DNA test and we don't match perfectly? And what does that mean for our family? And 9 times out of 10, it doesn't mean anything for your family. It just means that you aren't used to looking at DNA data. So let's talk about why DNA tests don't always match, and why, as you go farther out from the relationship, why do you not share the same amount of DNA with each of your aunts or with your second cousins and things like that? So we do have to get a little sciencey, because DNA is science. So I have to give you a tiny science lesson, but I'm not going to get all hung up on all the biology stuff about it. But the way that DNA works for our purposes, talking about genetic tests, so you have 23 chromosome pairs. We're all walking around with 23 chromosome pairs, and we get half of our DNA from each of our parents. So when you're talking about looking at the relationship between parents and children in DNA tests, if you're taking your DNA test and your parents have taken a DNA test, that is going to be the clearest DNA result. There's not going to be a lot of variety. The funny thing is, it's we say it's an average of 50% from each parent. You are getting 50% from each parent, but sometimes, because of what your parents might have inherited, and a lot of parents actually, when there's a thing at the Family History Center where you can put in your family tree and it shows you who else you're related to, and it's always funny when you go in with people who are married to each other and they put their family tree up and it turns out that they're actually 8th, 9th cousins, things like that. It's super common, because when you think about how many generations back that is. My husband and I actually thought that maybe we were related. We were expecting to be sort of related, but because of our mix of, he's not Polish or Chinese at all, we didn't have anybody in common. But anyway, you can have some overlapping DNA, and that kind of throws off the whole 50% thing, but you really are getting 50% from each of your parents. It's just that sometimes with the testing, DNA tests are not perfect. DNA test results, they're still working on it. They're getting better, but that could be the only reason. But if you've taken a DNA test and your parents have taken a DNA test and you don't share a lot of DNA with one of those parents, that's one of those moments of, okay, we need to have a conversation, because you were supposed to have 50% of your DNA from each of your parents. But the numbers get trickier with every other relative, including siblings and stuff like that. So that's what I want to talk about. Okay, there's 4 different kinds of DNA tests. So you will get different information depending on what kind of DNA test you're taking. Now, most of us take autosomal DNA tests, which sometimes when you're reading about them, it looks like it says AT DNA. That's how they shorten it, AT DNA. Autosomal DNA tests are the kind of tests that they do for ancestry. If you've had an ancestry DNA test, MyHeritage is autosomal. Like 23andMe does autosomal, but they also do some extra stuff. Autosomal DNA tests the DNA that you get from both parents. It tests, each of the copies. The copy you get from your mom, the copy you get from your dad. Women get 2 X chromosomes. They get an X chromosome from each parent. Their dad gives them an X and their mom gives them an X. But men have an XY. The X comes from their mom and the dad gives them the Y chromosome. That's a whole, we don't need to get into it, but that's how it works. Women walking around do not have a Y chromosome. So when you're looking at autosomal, it looks at both of those. But you can also get a different kind of test is called a Y DNA test. And that one, only men can take that test, and that shows them information about their direct paternal line, because that Y DNA is getting passed down from dad to dad, from dad to son. And then, so that is your direct paternal line, if that makes sense. The funny thing is that the Y DNA, let's see, which one is it? Is it the Y? I'm trying to think. One of them changes a little bit. I feel like the Y DNA is the one that doesn't change, and the mitochondrial DNA changes a little bit, but now I can't really remember. Okay, ignore that. You can see that, like, I don't have a Y chromosome, so I've never taken a Y DNA test, so my interest in it is slightly limited. But if you were looking to study more about a man's paternal line, then you would want to look at a Y DNA test. It's not something that I've done because I don't have a Y DNA. You can get a mitochondrial DNA test. This is the third kind, and people abbreviate it mtDNA. Mitochondrial DNA is not the opposite of a Y DNA test, which is how a lot of people sort of put it out there, but it does sort of test the opposite line, because a mitochondrial DNA test tests the mother's line. So mother to mother to mother. So we call that the umbilical line. If you can imagine all of the women who were pregnant and then had that child, that's the line. Now, the reason I say that it's not the opposite of the Y DNA test is it's not that only women can have a mitochondrial test. Men also have mothers. Men were involved with a woman in an umbilical cord. It's not just for women. But that's, if you do a mitochondrial DNA test for a man, it's going to tell him about his direct maternal line. So you have 2 different tests, Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA, that test really specific lines. And so you can get more specific about the ancestors or the cousins that you're related to off of those lines. But again, when you're talking about, here, I made you a little visual aid that we'll talk about in a second, but a direct line, you're really going to the outskirts and you're just following. Okay, so here's all of the, father to son, and then here's all of the mother to, well, it's mother to daughter, unless you get to, unless it's this guy. But these are all mother to daughter because it's a direct maternal line. You're missing a lot of people in the middle. So most of the testing, the autosomal, it's just kind of a mixed up group, and we'll talk about that. But, and there's a 4th kind of test. So you can get an xDNA test, which is, it's interesting. It's another kind of test. Remember, both men and women have xDNA. So again, you're not just looking at like a woman's side. people don't really, you can buy it, people use it for genetic genealogy, but nobody talks about the X DNA test. So I'm sure that there's a reason that you would want to do that. People who are more into DNA could tell you, but it's not something anybody talks about, so most of us don't need to know anything about it. And again, if you get an Ancestry or MyHeritage, then you're just looking at autosomal DNA. I had my DNA also tested by 23andMe, and I got a little bit of information about my mitochondrial DNA, but I don't have, if I'd had a Y chromosome, there might have been something in there about my Y DNA too. But again, if you're really interested in that, you can get those tests specifically done. But most of us just get autosomal DNA and then we go from there. So let's assume for the rest of the thing that we're just talking about people who have taken an autosomal DNA test and they're looking at their cousin matches. Okay, so I'm going to use the words cousin match, even though we could be talking about siblings or aunts or whatever. In this talk, cousins just means people that share DNA. So when you get matched with a cousin, what does that mean? What is the DNA test result trying to tell you? It means that you and somebody else have something in common. So DNA segments are, I don't know if you guys remember, I'm trying to think, I don't know how basic to go, but if you guys remember the parts of Jurassic Park, DNA is made up of little tiny pieces of stuff. And those pieces they're called nucleotides. And those are the things that have the letters, the apple tree chewing gum, if you guys remember that from basic science. You've got A's and T's and C's and G's, and those are making up your DNA. So those letters, those are nucleotides. When people have DNA that matches, then we're talking about them having sequences of nucleotides that are in the same order that match. And so DNA scientists measure the length of those sequences in something called a centimorgan or a CM. So when you get a match, it tells you how many CMs you match with this person. And that's telling you the actual, if we want to think of it as like a physical measurement of how much you match with this person. So a higher percentage is always going to be a more reliable match because a higher percentage indicates that you are closer to being related, to like having somebody in common, basically. Again, this is why we would expect your highest matches are going to be with your own parents because you should be 50-50. So and you have to have, so you've got measured in centimorgans. Again, you also have to have people who have taken the same DNA test that you have, from the same company, because companies match people inside of their own database. And you have to have people who have opted in to have that done. So this is the other thing, is that if you know somebody's taken a test and they're not showing up, it doesn't mean you're not related. It could mean that person didn't pick, yes, I want to be matched with people. Sometimes people take DNA tests just because they want to figure out what their ethnicity estimate is, and they don't actually want to see their cousin matches for whatever reason. So that could be why there's absolutely no record of this relative. It doesn't mean that person must not be blood related to you. There could be an error or two if the person thinks that they opted in, maybe they didn't. By the way, the ethnicity thing, it's pretty reliable. The larger the database is, the more reliable the ethnicity estimates are going to be. But how they're doing that, it's not like your DNA is actually giving anybody a geographical printout. It doesn't come with a GPS code for where that DNA came from. They're comparing it to other people in their database, and they have like base groups that they know, okay, this group of people came from this area. So if you match DNA with those people, that means that your DNA probably came from this area too. The more people that they get, the more scientific that they get, the more they work on it, the results change because the database changes. That's why you can take a DNA test and then for the next, like every 4 or 5 months, you're going to get, oh, your DNA results have been updated. And suddenly you're from like different geographic locations than the last time they told you about your DNA. It's because their database is changing. Your DNA is fine. Your DNA is holding still. Their database is changing. Sorry, I got reminders coming up for appointments. Okay, so let's talk about, sorry, I feel like that was a ton of background, but this is what makes DNA complicated. It's kind of like you need to know all these little things to understand what it is you're looking at. So I made a little visual. Okay, so this is you. You're the tester. You're getting 50% of your DNA from your parents. Now, you're getting about 25% from your grandparents, but here's the thing. It's not like your parents' DNA, okay, you are not splitting everything exactly down the middle. You're not getting exactly 25% of each of these people through your mother. You're getting 50% of whatever DNA your mom has. So you might end up getting more of your grandmother's DNA and less of your grandfather's DNA because that's just the mix that you got from your mom. So this is an average because your mom is not required to give you exactly half of each of her parents. You get 50% of whatever she's got going on. You get 50% of whatever your dad's got going on. So average of 25%. Down here, your great-grandparents, you have an average of 12.5%. But again, you want to talk about mixed up. Your mom got whatever half mix of whatever her mom decided to give her, didn't decide, but so you might have a mixture of these three people and basically nothing from this guy just because of the way your DNA lottery came out. You get down here, you only have an average of, almost just a little over 6% of your DNA is going to come from each of these people. And then you get down here and it's a little more than 3% of your DNA. Because again, you're not pulling DNA from all of these people. So if we were going to do equal, like a pie, equal pieces, you get exactly 3.125% of each of these people, then that would be great. But it doesn't work out that way. Now, the hard thing about that is that means that if you have other testers up here, I should have made sibling testers, but imagine that you have other people who are also taking the test. They're getting 50% of your parents if you guys are full-blood siblings, but their mom or your mom is not necessarily giving her same 50% to your sister. Your sister might have gotten the other 50% of your mom's DNA. It's unlikely because it's as unlikely as your sister getting exactly the same 50% that you got. You're probably going to have a little bit of a mix. That's why you can have two siblings that take DNA tests and things like their ethnicity estimates come back, and for some reason your sister is a little more Swedish than you are. Or you've got a first cousin and your sister seems to be a little more related to your first cousin than you are. Now, again, you shouldn't have wild variations. Wild variations are where we get into the whole realm of, okay, wait a second. Do we have the same parents? But slight variations are just because you're getting different mixes. And so you can see that if you have that much variety just with your sister, by the time you get down here and you're trying to DNA match people that share your great-great-great-grandparents, it's just kind of a mess. That's the problem. You can have somebody who you actually have this relative in common with somebody, but you guys don't share any DNA because you got 3% of this person's DNA and they got 3% of this person's DNA. And that means that there's a huge amount of this person's DNA that you guys are not going to have in common. And the chances that you got the same 3% or that you got an overlapping 3%, it just gets smaller the more generations you go down. This is kind of the problem with DNA testing, is that it tells you a lot of information, but it's really imperfect. And DNA testing, without the assistance of being matched to researched family trees, it just doesn't tell you as much as we wish it did, because we're just not getting the same amounts of DNA from the same people. You can have, all these relatives in common. You can have in common with people, but if you're getting different mixes of DNA, it's going to throw your results off. The other thing that throws results off is that you might match somebody through multiple people because of other relatives that you're not related to. If for some reason you have a cousin and they have relatives in common here through both parents, again, if this person is the child of two people who are second or third cousins, which, not uncommon. They're going to have more people giving them DNA, maybe over and over again. And so they might show up as a greater match. And it's not because they're more related to you through your family tree. They just might have more DNA from certain generations because they didn't have as many people in their family tree. Basically, if you've got people whose family trees are a little circular, a little curly, my husband's family he has a lot of family from West Virginia where that family tree just goes in loops. Those people are going to throw off your DNA results. My stepfather has a lot of DNA results actually that are a little thrown off because he had his grandmother and grandfather had, his grandmother's brother married his grandfather's sister and they had a whole passel of kids. So you've got all these kids that are a cousin relationship kind of farther back, but they have exactly the same DNA. And so it looks like they're related through that direct line, but they're not. It's because everybody had the generation above was exactly the same for all of those people. But the two immediate families obviously go on and branch out. And so you have an unusually high DNA connection to all these people, but it doesn't mean that they're actually closer to you generation-wise in the family tree. It's just because there was less variety than there normally would have been with cousins at that level. So that might have gotten a little complicated, but I hope that was helpful because, again, you don't want to ignore DNA. DNA is really interesting. It's really helpful. I'm doing a lot of work with DNA right now because my grandmother didn't know who her grandparents were because her mother was an orphan or a foster child or, basically had unknown parentage. So DNA is great for that because all of a sudden now I'm related to all these people that obviously have to be through a certain line. It's not enough to just get the name of a cousin match. You need the family tree and the research to figure out, okay, DNA's given me a big clue that we're related, but DNA cannot tell you how you're related. It can't really tell you, where in a descendant tree, like where does that person fall compared to you? You can look at tables of averages. They're really helpful. And it says, okay, the tables, like if you look up, average DNA relationships, it'll say if you have a certain number of centimorgans, this person could be an aunt or a first cousin or something like that. But again, the farther you go up, the smaller those centimorgan segments, the smaller the measurements are, and the wider how many people you're pulling DNA from becomes. So DNA tests, they try, but they just can only tell you, okay, it might be this person, it might be this person. Here's the 42 different relationships you could have with this person that shares this amount of DNA. And again, when you get into half siblings and loopy family trees and, you being twice removed from somebody who took a DNA test, it gets complicated. So use your DNA tests both with a grain of salt and with a good family tree. Do your research, try to match things up. That's how you use a DNA test. Do not get your results and then start calling people and telling people that there must be some sort of scandal because you're not as related to them as you were supposed to be. Again, that happens, but it's not as common, I think, as people think it is. Okay, well, that was the last of me for 2020. I hope that was helpful, not too sciencey. Didn't want to get all boring, but DNA is actually really interesting. We should probably talk more about DNA. If you have other questions about DNA, why don't you put them in the comments in this video, because then I can think about what people are interested in as you start to get DNA results back. Anyway, have a really good celebration for the new year. Have a good weekend, and I will see you next year.